At the end of the Second World War, President Roosevelt travelled to the Great Bitter Lake in the middle of the Suez Canal. At the same time, he sent another American warship to pick up the King of Saudi Arabia, King Abdulaziz. The meeting of King and President was to have powerful and disastrous consequences both for the West and, in a strange way, for Afghanistan. Roosevelt was dying, but over the last 13 years, he had used his power on an epic scale to transform the world. After the Wall Street crash and the terrible depression that followed, Roosevelt had taken charge. He had passed laws that broke up the banks, so they would never run out of control again. And he had rebuilt America with a series of giant dams that brought electrical power and employment to millions of people. And he had planned and fought a world war against Germany and Japan. Now, as Roosevelt sat waiting for Abdulaziz, no one could possibly have imagined the consequences of this meeting. For it was going to unleash forces that in the future would undermine everything that Roosevelt had worked for. His belief that politicians should use their power in a planned way to reshape the world. But Roosevelt knew that to keep that power, America needed oil. And he wanted to forge an alliance with the king to make sure that the vast Saudi oil fields remained under American control. In their conversation, the two men laid the foundations for an alliance that continues to the present day. America would get its oil, and in return, Saudi Arabia would receive wealth and security from America. But the king was well aware of the dangers of opening up his country to the influence of the modern West. And in the negotiations that followed, he laid down a condition. "We will take your technology and your money," he said, "but you must leave our faith alone." The Saudi faith was called Wahhabism. It was a radical, violent, and extremely puritanical form of Islam. And its followers among the Bedouin tribes hated the modern world. Wahhabism was part of a wider movement in Islam that had risen up in reaction to the European empires. Another was the Deobandi movement in India. They all believed that modern imperialism was corrupting the true nature of Islam and wanted to go back to a world based on the original teachings of the Islamic texts. Abdulaziz had harnessed this force in the 1920s to seize power. But he had unleashed something that didn't want to stop. The Wahhabists wanted to go on and create a caliphate across the whole of the Arab world. And to stop them, in 1929, Abdulaziz machine-gunned them. He ruthlessly killed the warriors who had made him king. But their belief, a violent, intolerant, and above all backward-looking version of Islam, remained at the heart of Saudi Arabian society. And the deal made that day on the Great Bitter Lake meant that America would get its oil, but it would also be protecting Wahhabism, a force that had its own global ambitions. Ambitions that were very different from America's. In 1964, King Faisal became the new leader of Saudi Arabia. Faisal set out to modernize the country. He created Western-style bureaucracies and a welfare system. He even allowed television for the first time. But he faced two threats. One was from the religious leaders inside Saudi Arabia. They were the Wahhabists, who had brought his family to power and gave his rule legitimacy. They distrusted any idea of modernizing Saudi society. Faisal was also facing a dangerous situation abroad, from communism that was spreading through the Arab world. His solution was simple. Faisal decided to use the religious leaders and their conservative beliefs as a force to counter the international threat of communism. he knew that this would also divert their attention away from his domestic policies. Faisal used the growing oil money to set up hundreds of schools and institutes across the Islamic world, some as far away as Pakistan. Their job was to spread Wahhabist ideas and help to turn Islam into a unified international force strong enough to stand up to communism. What Faisal was doing was taking the dangerous and unstable fanaticism at the heart of Saudi society and directing it outwards, beyond its borders. It was a ruthless way of creating stability in his own country. America gave this tacit approval because it was part of the global struggle against communism. Faisal gave America a glimpse of how uncontrollable an ally Saudi Arabia could be. And a Middle East war started. To begin with, it looked as though Israel would be defeated. But the American government came to its rescue, airlifting arms on a massive scale to prevent the Israelis from being overwhelmed. The Israelis counterattacked, and the Arabs faced a disaster. But then Saudi Arabia came to the rescue. Because King Faisal realized that his country had a weapon that could stop Israel. Overnight, Faisal raised the price of oil 5 times and threatened a complete embargo unless America forced Israel to pull back. It worked. A ceasefire was agreed, and everyone realized that the balance of power in the world had suddenly changed. When Saudi Arabia raised the price of oil, they did it to change the political balance of power in the world. But it also had another unexpected effect, because it allowed the men who ran the banks and the financial system in America and Britain to begin to break free of political control. The Saudi intelligence agencies worked with the CIA to ship arms and money to the Afghan rebels. On the surface, the Saudis did this because a fellow Muslim country had been invaded by communists. But it was also part of their attempt to export the dangerous fundamentalism at the heart of their own society. In 1979, a group of Saudi radicals had taken over the Grand Mosque in Mecca. For 2 weeks, the authorities had fought running battles with the insurgents. They discovered that a number of the attackers had been taught by the most senior religious leader in the country. It made the ruling family realize just how fragile their grip on power was. So as well as sending the money and the weapons, they encouraged young radicals to go and fight in Afghanistan. One of them was a young Osama bin Laden. The aim was to divert their anger. But it meant that with the arms would also come the pessimistic and intolerant version of Islam, Wahhabism. To begin with, these ideas would have little influence in Afghanistan, but they would take hold there and mutate into a dark and violent force that was completely at odds with Reagan's vision of freedom. But there was one industry in Britain that had survived, and in fact was growing. It was the arms industry and its vast trade with Saudi Arabia. But rather than strengthening the politicians' power, it undermined it further through corruption.
The King's train was 20 minutes late arriving at Victoria Station. It was delayed while a suspicious box on a bridge over the track was checked and found to be harmless. When he eventually stepped onto the platform, it was to a full royal welcome.
Through the 1970s, British arms companies had signed more and more contracts with the Saudis, and they became a central part of a new industry that was run from the very heart of the British government.
We're in the Ministry of Defence in Whitehall. Behind these doors, there's a room which few people apart from Arab sheikhs and other potential foreign customers have ever set eyes on before.
This way, please.
This is it, the permanent defence equipment exhibition, the supermarket of the sales organisation which this year will sell nearly £600 million worth of British military hardware to foreign governments. Week in, week out, overseas service chiefs come here discreetly to shop for anything from guided missile destroyers and aircraft to a pair of army boots. And they've got quite a choice. There are hundreds of individual British manufacturers in this business. Glossy coloured brochures in every language, including, of course, Arabic. Everywhere in this amazing exhibition, there are models showing the hardware in action, showing what the hardware can do. Big missiles, little missiles. Here's the short blowpipe surface-to-air missile with which one soldier can bring an aircraft out of the sky straight from the shoulder. More missiles here, the short Tiger Cat missile, simple in operation, recommended for its high lethality at low cost.
Aircraft are very expensive these days, and so you don't want them to have just one role when that one role is advanced.
By the 1980s, the giant orders from Saudi Arabia had become essential to Britain. While much of British industry had closed, the arms business kept growing.
From air to ground. No, I'm a Prime Minister. I have to say the super saleswomen do their job.
And in 1985, Mrs. Thatcher announced what was going to be the biggest arms deal in history.
The extraordinary arms deal, which has impressed military experts throughout the world. It emerged today that Britain and Saudi Arabia have signed what's thought to be one of the world's biggest arms agreements. The deal will mean Saudi Arabia will get many more combat planes, training aircraft, new mine hunters, 2 new air bases, and much training and support. It means Britain is pulling level with, if not overtaking, the United States as the biggest military supplier to the Saudis.
The Al Yamama deal was presented as a triumph of British ingenuity and skill. But ever since, there have been allegations that really it was secured by vast bribes to key members of the Saudi establishment. British Aerospace admit that there were payments, but insist they were not bribes. But then, in 1990, it became clear that all the arms trade with Saudi Arabia had been a complete charade. Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait, and the leaders of Saudi Arabia realized that despite all this hardware, all the planes, the missiles, the bombs and the radar systems, that their country was incapable of using it properly to defend itself against Saddam Hussein. So they had to turn to America and its military might for help.
At my direction, elements of the 82nd Airborne Division, as well as key units of the United States Air Force, are arriving today to take up defensive positions in Saudi Arabia. I took this action to assist the Saudi Arabian government in the defense of its homeland.
Osama bin Laden had returned from Afghanistan, and he went to see the Saudi defense minister and pleaded with him not to let the Americans come. He offered to raise a force of Mujahideen fighters in Afghanistan and bring them to defend Saudi Arabia instead. But the defense minister turned him down. And within weeks, over 500,000 American soldiers had arrived in Saudi Arabia. Bin Laden saw it as the corrupt takeover by the West of the very heart of Islam. When the Russians left Afghanistan, the different Mujahideen groups turned on each other and began a vicious struggle for power. Kabul was completely destroyed as the different groups fired thousands of rockets indiscriminately into the heart of the city. And Kabul became a living hell. The poppy fields of Helmand became the center of a multi-million-dollar business, irrigated by the dams and canals built 40 years before by the American government. Out of the chaos came 2 extreme and violent reactions. Both ruthlessly simplified the world, and both, although they were completely contradictory, were rooted in Wahhabism, the intolerant fundamentalism that came from Saudi Arabia. One was the Taliban. They started as a group of students in religious schools in Pakistan called madrasas, where many Afghan children had gone to study. They became the core of a revolution, that spread rapidly through Afghanistan. Although they were in Pakistan, most of the madrasas had been created over the previous 20 years by money from Saudi Arabia. They were part of the massive effort that had been started by King Faisal to spread fundamentalism throughout the Islamic world. And the ideas that the madrasas taught were very close to Saudi Wahhabism. When the Taliban swept into Kabul, they went to the presidential palace and tore out all painted images of living things, even removing the faces off the stone lions. The society the Taliban built was based on an imagined idea of the past, a recreation of how they thought Islamic society had been run in the 7th century. All modernization was swept away. Women were not to be educated, and all film and music was banned. And even the bodies of dead communists were dug up and burnt to cleanse and purify the land. The other reaction came from Osama bin Laden. Bin Laden had come back to Afghanistan, determined to lead an Islamist revolution. But his ideas were very different from the Taliban. He wanted to use Islamic principles in a new way, to make it a revolutionary force in the modern world. To go forwards, not backwards. But the problem was that these ideas had failed to capture the public imagination, not just in Afghanistan, but throughout most of the Islamic world. Bin Laden was convinced that what was stopping this revolution was America. He had seen how American money had corrupted Saudi Arabia. Now he believed that America was corrupting the minds of Muslim people everywhere and preventing them from rising up and liberating themselves. Bin Laden's Islamist ideas began to mutate and become mixed with the intolerant and anti-modern anger of Wahhabism. Out of it came a dark and apocalyptic jihadism. It's said that the only way to create a revolution would be to attack what he called the far enemy directly. The dramatic shock would somehow liberate the masses. But they weren't the only fighters who had left Afghanistan. Abu Musab al-Zarqawi had gone to Afghanistan to fight the Soviets back in the 1980s. Then he had stayed on to work with Osama bin Laden. And in 2003, he went to Iraq and set up a jihadist group called Al-Qaeda in Iraq to fight the American invasion. Al-Zarqawi was powerfully influenced by bin Laden's ideas, but he took them much further. He and his group killed anyone who they decided did not believe in their fundamentalist ideas and deserved to die. Even the original founders of Al-Qaeda were shocked, and they sent him a letter telling him to stop killing civilians. But al-Zarqawi ignored them. He was convinced that the insurgency in Iraq could be used to spread an Islamist revolution throughout the Arab world.
ثلاثة أشهر يكون بإذن الله تعالى الجو مهيئا نعلن شيئا عن الإمارة الإسلامية.
But before he could do this, the Americans found al-Zarqawi and dropped a large bomb on him. But it didn't stop the spread of the idea. Despite al-Zarqawi's death, his organization survived and began to mutate into something even more ferocious and ambitious. But as it did so, it was possessed by ghosts from the past. What re-emerged was the fierce, intolerant vision of Wahhabism that had survived from the 1920s. It had spread outwards through Afghanistan in the 1980s and 90s, where it had become mixed with modern Islamist ideas. But now, Faced by the nihilistic horror of post-invasion Iraq, any idea of building a new revolutionary future disappeared. And instead, the conservative and backward-looking Wahhabism became the dominating influence, with its desire to retreat to an imagined past. In 2013, the Islamic State of Iraq and the Levant was formed, known as ISIS in the West. Its aim is to create a unified caliphate throughout the Islamic world. And although it uses the techniques of modern media, it is at heart the same violent dream that had driven the Bedouins who had created the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia in the 1920s. But it is an uncertain war. Western politicians are having to accept that the simple division between good and evil doesn't exist.
We had a huge trust deficit, in part because the United States had, to be fair, we had helped to create the problem we're now fighting. How? Because when the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan, we had this brilliant idea that we were going to come to Pakistan and create a force of mujahideen, equip them with Stinger missiles and everything else to go after the Soviets inside Afghanistan. And we were successful. The Soviets left Afghanistan, and then we said, great, goodbye, leaving these trained people who were fanatical in Afghanistan and Pakistan, leaving them well armed, creating a mess, frankly, that at the time we didn't really recognize. We were just so happy to see the Soviet Union fall, and we thought, okay, fine, we're okay now. Everything's going to be so much better. Now you look back, the people we're fighting today, we were supporting in the fight against the Soviets.
We also have a history of kind of moving in and out of Pakistan. I mean, let's remember here, the people we are fighting today, we funded 20 years ago. And we did it because we were locked in this struggle with the Soviet Union. They invaded Afghanistan, and we did not want to see them control Central Asia. And we went to work. And it was President Reagan, in partnership with the Congress, led by Democrats, who said, you know what, sounds like a pretty good idea. Let's deal with the ISI and the Pakistani military, and let's go recruit these mujahideen. And let's get some to come from Saudi Arabia and other places, importing their Wahhabi brand of Islam so that we can go beat the Soviet Union. And guess what? They retreated. They lost billions of dollars, and it led to the collapse of the Soviet Union. So there's a very strong argument, which is, wasn't a bad investment to end the Soviet Union, but let's be careful what we sow because we will harvest. So we then left Pakistan. We said, okay, fine. You deal with the stingers that we've left all over your country. You deal with the mines that are along the border. And by the way, we don't want to have anything to do with you. In fact, we're sanctioning you. So we stopped dealing with the Pakistani military and with ISI, and we now are making up for a lot of lost time.
Is it a dark existential threat? Or is it really a front being used in an ongoing complex power struggle inside Iraq? We just don't know. At the end of the Soviet science fiction film, Solaris, the astronaut returns home. Everything seems real and normal, but somehow he doesn't trust in anything any longer. Although we have returned from Afghanistan, our leaders also seem to have lost faith in anything. And the simple stories they tell us don't make sense any longer. The experience of Afghanistan has made us begin to realize that there is something else out there, but we just don't have the apparatus to see it. What is needed is a new story, and one that we can believe in.